This week on Inside Olympia, we meet the new head of the Washington National Guard, Major General Gent Welsh. What are his priorities for the Army and Air National Guard? What are the challenges he sees on the home front and internationally? And how is his team preparing for the 2024 election? We'll cover that and more.
From the TBW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. For the first time in more than a decade, the state of Washington has a new head of the National Guard. The state's longtime Adjutant General, Bret Daugherty, retired in June. His replacement is Major General Gent Welsh. What are his priorities for the Guard? What does he see as near-term and long-term challenges? What is his vision for leading the Guard in the years ahead? Joining me now, and for the full hour this week, is the state's new Adjutant General. Welcome to the program. Good to meet you. Good to see you.
Thank you, Austin. Pleasure to be here.
We're going to talk a lot about the role of the military department, what you oversee, what your vision is, but I do want to start with something that is a tragedy that's been in the news this week, and that is the deaths of two young aviators from NAS Whidbey Island. Their Growler plane aircraft crashed near Mount Rainier, I think actually closer to White Pass this week. Two young women aviators. I'd like to give you a chance to reflect on that loss and also talk to us about the role that the Guard has been playing in the search and recovery efforts.
You bet. So personally, it hits really hard. So as we were talking about earlier, my daughter is actually a lieutenant in the Air Force going through Air Force pilot training. Wow. And just seeing those faces on TV just made me make a few extra phone calls last night.
I bet. Yeah, so, two 31-year-old.
Yeah, it's just, it's horribly tragic. I mean, any aviation accident is horribly tragic, that one especially. So what's the Guard doing with that? So really from the beginning, I've been in constant communication with the commander of Navy Region Northwest, really offering up anything that the National Guard could do to help. It's one of those things where the Navy is in charge. It's not our thing, but we're operating in support of that. So two things. One is we've helped out with heavy lift helicopters, so our CH-47 Chinooks. It's that twin-engine helicopter that you see rumbling around the freeways a little bit. Mm-hmm. But that is a very high altitude crash. That's at about 6,000 feet. So
and very inaccessible.
And super inaccessible. So we've got the helicopter support. You've got to basically sling load. So think of a giant net underneath with a bunch of equipment going up from one place to another. So we've been able to help out with that. But really the thing we're into now is really the site security. So that's one of the things that the National Guard does well, is really help secure sort of the accident scene, the crash scene, if you will, and really try to keep people out of that area and let the Navy do what the Navy does best and do their investigation, and we'll get out of there.
I should note that the governor has approved this involvement on the part of the Guard. Just so I'm clear, are you putting, then you have the helicopter support, but you're putting National Guard members actually on the ground in this mountainous territory? Are they like staying the night, camping out?
Well, we're going to run, again, 24/7 operations, but multiple shifts. So think of it where you go up on the mountain, you do your shift, you recover back to probably Yakima. You'll be eating, normal meals and staying in a hotel, but it's not going to be roughing it, if you will, up there.
Flying in and out, though, getting people in and out by air.
They're going to be driving up there. So if you think about that area, so there's a lot of other, even though it's super inaccessible, it's right in the middle of hunting season, so you've got all kinds of forest roads and maybe folks that are used to getting up into this certain territory that maybe need to go somewhere else.
Okay. Let's step back and talk about your history with the Guard, and it's a long history, and your career in the military more broadly, and what brought you to this point. But why don't you give us the backstory?
Sure. It goes all the way back. So it goes 36 years back. It goes back to a time where the Soviet Union was in existence. The Berlin Wall was up. We were facing off in Europe against the evil empire, as President Reagan said at the time. So a long service history. And I did the math a while ago, and I had actually been in about 47% of the time that the Air Force has been an Air Force. So I really feel old. So came in 1988, farm kid from Eastern Oregon, a very small town called Vale, Oregon, not famous for a whole lot, but came in, and enlisted as a security policeman, so kind of a military police airman, so stationed over in Europe during this, the previous Cold War, as I'll call it, and then a few years over there, over at Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane, and that's really where my sort of association with Washington started. So got off active duty in 1992, went right into the Washington National Guard, really was not ready for my service to end at that point. Super interested in again, having maybe a different life and then coming and doing this Guard thing. It helped a lot that I met my wife in Spokane, and we started off from that point. So went to school at Eastern Washington University, and it really wasn't until 1997 that I was a full-time member of the Guard, and it really takes off from there. A lot of time in Eastern Washington, sort of moving up through the system, squadron command, and things like that. And then moved over to this side of the state in 2008. Like I put it, sort of got an offer I couldn't refuse. You need to come over here, and the rest is history.
And you eventually rose to overseeing the Air National Guard. There's two components, the Army National Guard, Air National Guard. Just prior to this, you were in charge of the Air National Guard.
Correct.
I want to ask you also just about what struck me in reading your military service history is the number of deployments that you've been on over your career. Can you reflect on that a little bit and the experience you've had?
You bet. I mean, it goes all the way back to, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, sort of the first Gulf War, and then to what I would call Operation Northern Watch, Southern Watch. That's a lot of the policing of the no-fly zones, Saudi Arabia, so basically keeping Saddam Hussein in check. And then 2003 and 4, Bosnia, so on the hunt for war criminals and things like that over there. And then 2007, another deployment to Iraq. And that's about it. I'm thankful that I'll probably never see maybe the Middle East again in my career, but a lot of time in very warm and very sandy places earlier on in my life.
So why did you want this position as the Adjutant General, the commander of the Washington National Guard in 2024? As I noted in the introduction, it has been more than a decade since this position was open, but when it became open,
You bet.
and you knew that, Adjutant General Daugherty was going to be retiring, what made you put your name forward?
Well, it really boils down to we're living in a pretty scary world, and it's going to take all of us, and it's going to take some leadership, and it's going to take our team to really help the state navigate through some of the challenges, potentially down the road with the election and you name it there, and then overseas. Super scary now with Russia doing what they're doing in Ukraine, with Iran, and potentially some more conflict to happen in the Middle East with Iran and Israel. North Korea is certainly becoming more of a problem than they were just a month ago. So you've got all that, and then you've got China. You've got China that wraps around all that. Is probably our most dangerous adversary that we've had really since the fall of the Soviet Union. So a lot of challenges, that those challenges need someone with just a little bit of experience dealing with those, and just really, want to take the opportunity to give something back. I've been a huge recipient of a whole lot of mentorship and guidance from not only General Daugherty, but General Lowenberg before him. And this is, I'm on the far backside of the career curve. And this is just like I try to do every day is just take the day to try to make a good, make something good happen to someone else, and pay it forward.
When you talk about those international threats, and you are sitting in Washington State at the headquarters of the military department versus at the Pentagon, how are you thinking about them and the role of the Washington National Guard in the context of this geopolitical environment we're in? Both in terms of our geography, where we're located on the West Coast, but also in terms of the role of National Guards in terms of being more of a front line in our voluntary Army kind of posture these days.
So a couple things on that. I mean, Washington State has a number of very large military bases. It's one of the premier force projection platforms on the West Coast. So this state could potentially be a target. The state could be a target for a cyber attack. One of the first opening shots that I think will happen if we ever get in something in the Pacific with China is cyber attacks that potentially knock out the ability to deploy forces into the Pacific. So we have to think about that. Not necessarily a unique National Guard problem, but it's a state problem, and it's a problem that the governor's going to have to contend with. So we've got that. So second thing is really what do we do to support a Pacific type of conflict? So do we have the right missions? Are our folks trained in the right way? Do we have, is our manning where it needs to be? And really, most importantly, are folks mentally ready to go? This is an environment that we have not been in for a number of years, where when I was first coming in the military, we knew what the Russians were going to do. We knew what the challenges of the Soviet Union were going to be. Our airmen and soldiers right now don't fully understand the threat that we're facing from the People's Republic of China. So there's that piece as well. And then again, domestically, so you can almost trace every foreign problem that we face back to something that happens here domestically, whether it's support for Israel and then potentially corresponding Gaza protests, whether it's China issues and then looking at the fentanyl problem that we've got in the state. And you can trace a lot of the fentanyl precursor chemicals all the way back to the People's Republic of China. So really trying to make sure that not only our Washington National Guard members understand the threats that we're facing, but really everybody in Washington state. We should have a good conversation about if this country is ready or not for something bad to happen. And there's a lot of indications that in some ways more likely than not, right now that something could be on the horizon.
And for all of the headlines we read about all of the unrest and violence in the rest of the world, it's easy to be complacent. It's easy to say, well, at least that's not us. I think your message is we should perhaps be more on alert.
Absolutely. Time to wake up and plug in and see what's going on around you, because that could be here.
Your predecessor, when we last spoke, talked about the National Guard no longer being kind of a strategic reserve for the U.S. military. And we'll talk about the state functions as well, but being more of an operational combat reserve, I think is the terminology he used. Help us understand, when you think about the 6,000 Guard members, 8,000 Guard members, 6,000 Army, 2,000 Air, what is their role in the broader kind of military construct here?
You bet. So he talked about it, and he was absolutely right. So it is the primary combat reserve of the Army and the Air Force. So the primary combat reserve. So, and that's just not focusing on the word reserve. So there are plenty of missions that we do day in and day out, mostly Air National Guard missions right here in Washington State. I mean, a great example is the Western Air Defense Sector. So that organization basically keeps an eye on the airspace from the Mississippi River west. That is a day in and day out mission, and there is really no reserve, about it. That's a full-time mission. And again, there are other missions where we train to, and we just hope that something never happens. But again, the main value and the main selling point of the National Guard as a primary combat reserve is that it's so cost effective. It's pennies on the dollar in terms of the money that the American taxpayer has to spend on a National Guard bit of force structure versus, maybe our neighbors across the freeway at JBLM. So the National Guard is super cost effective and really trains to the same standards. And I think there's a much larger conversation that is sort of going to happen here in the next year or two with declining defense budgets and really flatline defense budgets. There's a lot of reasons for that. But is there room for more reliance on the National Guard and Reserve as a way to keep in some ways some of the same combat power that we have, but at a much less cost? If you look at where, again, the defense budgets are and where really the national budget is, there's not much more to squeeze out of that. So how do you do it? How do you do it, again, more cost effective? So we as a National Guard need to be credible and ready to go if offered potentially additional force structure that maybe would come out of the active duty in the future.
And then how ready are these National Guard forces? Because you said, I think you just said a moment ago, sort of training to the same standard. But there's a big difference between being part-time and full-time. It's one thing to go through a boot camp, quite another to be regularly getting opportunities to practice.
You bet. So two things to think about on that. So one of the things that makes the National Guard unique is the fact that our folks do that job for 20 years. They're an infantryman for 20 years. They're a pilot for 20 years. Flying that same aircraft, operating that same equipment. You can't replicate that on the active duty side. You may have a soldier that comes in, does one tour, learns a little bit and leaves, and it's a constant revolving door on the active duty, whereas the Guard makes up for the maybe the not doing it all the time with
A lot more
a
stability.
whole lot of depth and stability. So you've got that piece. And again, I talked about operating with the same standards. One of the things we have to contend with is the proposition is no longer 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. That's long past, but
That's the advertisement from when
the
we were growing
commercials,
up.
the commercials are still there. But really the proposition is maybe a month or 2 months, 30 days, 60 days. But I do think for the credibility of the Guard, we do need to follow the same standards that the active duty does and go to the same exercises and really do everything we can to train to that. So there's not a difference when you deploy somewhere and you see United States Air Force or United States Army on someone's name tag. You can't go, okay, you must be from the National Guard or you must be from the active duty. We need to strive for, really complete plug and play with our services.
So much more interchangeable.
Yes.
And much less distinction.
Absolutely.
division.
Yeah, my ideal is you can't tell a National Guardsman from somebody from active duty.
Just going back to, and I want to stick kind of with the military role and the national security role, to your point about the potential threats and the aggression we're seeing from China, from Russia. Recently, there were Chinese and Russian bombers off of Alaska for the first time together, as I understand it. They were intercepted, or we sent our guys up to kind of wave back at them. But that got a lot of news coverage. How do you evaluate that instance? What's going on there? How should we read that?
That should be a wake-up call that, we're back into a situation geopolitically where we have, I would say, the free world and folks that are pushing for democracy and the axis of autocracy. And that's not my word. That's someone else coined that. So whoever did that, I'm sorry for stealing that. But that's really what we're up against. We're up against really a clash of do we want it this way or do we want it that way? So when you see things in the news where two countries who, for the most part, throughout history have not been natural allies. The Chinese want a lot of the things that the Russians have, certainly in the Far East, but to see the state of the world where they're allied enough to be able to fly off the United States coast and say, what are you going to do about that? That should wake us all up.
Okay, so now that you've scared us for the first few minutes, let's talk about some of the strategic partnerships that this National Guard is involved with overseas forces, and help us understand what that purpose is and what gains you hope to get from that. So there's a National Guard State Partnership Program where we've partnered with Thailand and Malaysia. There's cross-training that's going on, delegations coming here, our folks going there. They're actually doing exercises together, I believe with the Strykers even, the Stryker vehicles. So, and you just had a contingent, I believe, of women from the Thai military here. What's
Malaysia.
Malaysia, okay.
Thai,
So what's the purpose of these partnerships, especially as we're talking about alignments and geopolitics?
So the state partnership goes back to really the fall of the Soviet Union. So it goes back to a time when the Soviet Union retreated back into what we now know as Russia, and you left a lot of countries out there in Central and Eastern Europe looking for a partner, looking for somebody to kind of say, we've learned the Soviet way for so many years, we'd love to be a little bit more Western aligned. So, and why the state partnership program is so important is it provides that continuity and stability. So whereas an active duty person maybe does one exercise in a partner country and then they go, PCS to a different assignment, the Guard is going to do that year after year after year. So you can build a lot of relationship depth with the National Guard State Partner Program. So one of the things I always like to say is we are going to grow old together. We are going to grow old because you will see me year after year after year. And that's what's able to help us a lot in Thailand and Malaysia in high context cultures in Asia. Relationships come first, and then really business comes second. So you've got to spend the time to build that relationship, and then you can get things down the road like these exchanges. So Thailand and Malaysia are hugely important for the national security piece of the United States. So if you look at what we now call GPC or global power competition, it's all about China. It's all about not necessarily containing China, but building those regional alliances with again, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore, Taiwan, So you see that play out in the state partner program. Again, I always look at it that every exercise that we're doing in Thailand and Malaysia is potentially another exercise that our competitor in the People's Republic of China is not able to do. So we're able to actually use National Guardsmen to fulfill national defense strategy tasks through the state partner program. It's really cool.
So how do you think those relationships that are being built could pay off or pay dividends in the future, especially if we get to a situation where tensions escalate, let's say with China?
Well, I mean, at the far end, I mean, having somebody to call in that region and having relationships and contacts to go, hey, what are you seeing? This is what we're seeing. You're going to find that those two countries in particular are very concerned about what's going on with their neighbor. There's a lot of economic consequences that play out in Asia, a lot of economic consequences in this country, but from a security partner of choice, I would rather have a much more robust relationship that we've spent years maintaining than to try to build something up from scratch when we needed it. So, I mean, on the far end, maybe through the state partner program, it opens up access basing and overflight, in some of those countries that maybe the U.S. needs down the road. But again, unless the U.S. is in there and competing every day, every week, every year with China, we're not going to have the accesses when we need them. And I think SPP does that for us.
Would you go so far as to say there's a deterrent effect? Is China paying attention to this? Or is this too small fries?
I hope they are. I hope they are. And I say that because, again, I want, the Chinese military to wake up every day and go, why is the United States now interested in Stryker interoperability? Why are they interested in training female airmen, training female soldiers? These are things that I think our competitors are not doing in those areas. These are true relationship things. These are not transactional relationships that I think our competitor does in that region. So I hope that it is a deterrent value. I hope that it does cause them to wonder why the U.S. is spending so much time and energy focused on SPP.
For the uninitiated, can you explain what Strykers are and then what Stryker interoperability would look like? Do they have them too?
They do. We actually sold Thailand Stryker. So Stryker, 8-wheeled armored vehicle that you see, every now and then if you drive between Seattle and Yakima, a lot of times you'll see them out on the road. They have them. We have them. It's just one of those peanut butter chocolate marriages that works. It's something that, again, we can actually fall in on Strykers for training in Thailand. We have actually Strykers there that when we do exercises, we can just come in and do mutual things that I think benefit both countries there.
So we should step back and explain that you oversee the state military department. And just before we go to break, let's talk about the components that are under your command now, so that we have sort of the broader understanding. We've talked a lot about the military piece, but your book of business, your responsibilities, what are you overseeing on a day-to-day basis?
It's about 8,500 folks when you tally them all up. So a number of different components. We talked about the National Guard component first. You've got 6,000 Army Guard, about 2,000 Air. You've got the Emergency Management Division that handles all of emergency management for the entire state of Washington in that portfolio. You've got the Homeland Security Advisor for the state of Washington as part of that portfolio as well. You've got the Washington Youth Challenge Academy in there. And then you've got what I would call sort of the wraparound piece that makes the military department work. So IT, human resources, communications, finance, things like that just keep the wheels greased. So it's pretty complex. And again, it goes from this Washington to that Washington, and it spans all kinds of time zones. But it's a great agency, and it's great every morning to wake up and know that your whole job is to provide a public service for the state.
And we are going to talk about some of the priorities around those other responsibilities. I do want to ask you just about, because you've put such an emphasis on the importance of the National Guard in being on the forefront of this country's military protection and national security. Where do things stand in terms of recruiting and retaining those 8,000 National Guard members generationally? I mean, you talked about your daughter is now in the Air Force, in military service, but what's your observation about whether we're going to have the people to do this work?
Well, the good thing is, if you would have asked me a year ago how I felt about recruiting and retention, I'd give you a different answer than today. Actually, over this last year, we were over 100% of our goals on recruiting, both Air and Army, which has not been the case for about the last 4 years. So we're on an upswing. I think you tap into the talent that is Gen Z. So if you look at a lot of the studies on Gen Z, besides the fact that they're on their phone all the time, they are super dedicated to public service. They're super dedicated to the idea of military service. So that is one thing that we're finding about this generation is there's a little bit higher propensity to serve. So we have to tap into that, but we also have a system that you may have a good propensity to serve, but can you actually qualify? We have medical standards that date back to the 1960s. And, if you coughed once or twice too many times at the doctor's office when you were 6 and got a prescription, that comes back to get you, when you're 18 going through the military insurance process. So a lot of the medical pieces have to catch up. This is again a society that likes to get tattoos. There's tattoo standards, and you're seeing now that the military is maybe not necessarily changing the standards so much, but recognizing that we have to meet more people maybe where they're at.
Police departments are doing that.
They absolutely are. So you have
So
to kind of look at.
something that, and to that end, is this also a case where those agencies are having trouble recruiting? They're having to change their standards. Perhaps the old guard has to say, we can put up with hair that's a little longer or tattoos that weren't allowed before.
Well, I think you have
facial hair.
You have to put it through the filter of, does this requirement really affect military readiness? And if the answer is no, it doesn't. The bad guys don't care if you got 1 or 50 tattoos. But you're seeing that. You're seeing sort of the standards change a little bit. But again, I don't think that change fundamentally affects military readiness.
What do you think changed in the last year? Any analysis of that in terms of recruitment?
I don't know. Maybe the economy a little bit, is sort of the unemployment rate has ticked up a little bit.
A little bit more distance on COVID, I suppose.
A little bit further away from COVID. You're back to, I would say, normal a little bit. You're back into the schools talking to folks. I think our folks, again, have put a lot more effort into it, too. It used to be you could kind of sit back and wait for the phone to ring, and that's not the environment that we're in right now.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we return, we continue our interview with the new head of Washington's National Guard, back right after this.
Stolen vehicles are a problem. We need a solution. Pursuits are not the solution to that.
Washington State is not missing high-speed police pursuits. Washington State is missing the possibility of a high-speed pursuit.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Major General Gent Welsh of the Washington National Guard. And we've talked a lot about kind of the international dynamic, the role that Washington State and the National Guard plays in that, and sort of the military component of this role and the Guard. But I do want to talk to you about what's happening on the domestic front. We've got a looming election, so let's start there. Help us understand how your cybersecurity team is helping to and has helped to harden our election systems, most of which are disconnected from the internet, but to the extent that there is, for instance, the voter rolls or the voter registration system. And then pre and post-election, security and other, what's the state of affairs there?
So our involvement in elections goes back to really 2016. That was when Secretary Wyman was in there before. So when we started to see overseas a lot of interest from Russia and China and even Iran into our election system.
Constant attempts to.
Yes, it only made sense. So if you have, I would say, military-grade adversaries looking at your election system, we should probably do some cross-training and work together. So that was really what started it. So how would we as the National Guard, who were trained to do all kinds of manner of cyber things across the world, look at our own election system like an adversary would, and try and harden it? So we kind of came at it from that angle. So looked a lot at the election system for again a number of years, found some different things, actually went to a completely different election system now than what we had before. But we're actually able to work a lot with Secretary of States to office, both Secretary Hobbs and Secretary Wyman, to just go, look, you're going to need to do these things to secure the system. Not only just the vote tabulation pieces of it, but how the numbers are reported, and they're almost to the point where they're completely self-sufficient now. We're going to do a mission during this year, sort of in a state active duty status, to kind of keep an eye on it. But again, it's a very safe and very secure system.
Do you know, or can you speak to the extent to which we're still being targeted in this election cycle by these adversaries in the same way that we were, that prompted Secretary Wyman at the time in 2016 to kind of pull that fire alarm and say, hey, we need some help here?
So constantly tested. I mean, it's not just again, from a disinformation standpoint, your vote doesn't count, so don't go vote. But it's just the mechanics of the election. So what things in our vote by mail system, what things in in another state that uses levers and this and that, what weaknesses and vulnerabilities exist in those systems that an adversary could potentially target? And that's what we work with the Secretary of State on. Hey, you might want to think about this or think about that.
And the National Guard has a cybersecurity team. Again, these are people who their day jobs may be with top tech firms, but they are also serving in the National Guard, and then they can apply their skills to help with this problem. Is that what's happening?
Absolutely, and they're driving far nicer cars than I drive, coming down and doing this thing 1 week in a month. So our weekend cyber talent, they do work in those tech companies. They do make a lot of money. They can make more money in an hour of overtime probably than they make all weekend, but the work that they absolutely love is this kind of work. It's something they can sink their teeth into that helps their citizens, helps their neighbors, feel more secure, help counter some of the nonsense that's out there on elections.
We're also pretty sensitive about having our military not involved in our elections, and yet we saw what happened after the 2020 election. We had National Guard members who were deployed to this state capitol and to the U.S. Capitol post January 6th. So what are the conversations like right now, again, leading up to this election and anticipating what could happen post-election in terms of what role the National Guard might play here in Washington and in the other Washington?
So I think the main role is just explaining to folks that we don't self-deploy. There's just been a lot of nonsense in the media about what the military is going to do and using the National Guard. That's just not how it works. The first thing that happens is a phone call from the governor to me saying, hey, we may need some help here or there, and off we go. Or, you find a city that's having problems that they can't solve and mutual aid can't solve, and it goes up through our emergency management process, and off we go. But again, you're right. I think we are in a position now of really anticipating things that we didn't anticipate in January 6th of 2001. The potential of violence, whether that's on the right, if you will, or on the left. I think it depends on what the outcome of the election is. But that's one that, again, I think we have to have the conversation within the National Guard. What would we say we can do? What kind of numbers could we offer up? Before it was, hey, I need 500 folks to go to Seattle and help out here. And another thing to do is we've got to help sensitize our go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, there was what was happening here in Olympia. There was also civil unrest in the Seattle area that the governor did deploy the National Guard in that case too.
So one was a very quick response, and that was January 6th down here, and one was, I would say, a very deliberate plan, and that was really post-George Floyd in Seattle. So
in terms of preparation and being in a ready waiting posture in 2024 as compared to 2020, how is that different? How does that feel different in terms of the conversations that are happening, the planning that may be taking place, the conversations perhaps with the other Washington or with other National Guard leaders around the country? What's changed in 4 years?
So just the fact that we think that something could happen. Not that it will happen, but if something does happen, how would we respond? What kind of training would we need to give or have to give folks in a hurry to get them out the door? I'm more focused on something happening potentially in Washington State versus Washington, D.C. We've actually offered up no one yet to the inauguration and that business, because I'm kind of keeping my powder dry, so to speak, just making sure that we can cover this Washington first. But it's something, again, without getting into a lot of detailed plans and everything, it's something we're thinking about. But again, it's something that is a huge last resort. It's not the tool that you grab first in the toolkit.
This fits into a broader umbrella, I suppose, of homeland security. We can have domestic threats. We can have overseas threats that threaten our homeland security. It can be election or not election related. But just as we spoke in the first half about perhaps complacency regarding foreign military threats. What would you say about our homeland security status in this state and in this country? And where do you see opportunities for improvement?
We got to get the band back together. That's the main thing. So if you look at what was done in some ways pre 9/11, so if you look at two predecessors of mine ago, so General Lowenberg, he started having a conversation about homeland security topics before 9/11. I don't think he was Nostradamus, but he certainly saw the need that, hey, with extremism on the rise across the world, we should probably talk about if something happens here. So we have 9/11, and then sort of everybody rushes to the homeland security space. I think 20 some odd years past that, I think it's atrophied a little bit. So I think the forums, the fora that we used to have in the state to talk about homeland security executive councils, some of that band's got to get back together again and talk about not only the extremist threats to terrorism, but what happens when, again, the Chinese, through a hacker group called Volt Typhoon, shut down our critical infrastructure in the state. What's going to happen when a lot of the little things that particular country is deployed into our infrastructure is activated, and we end up far worse than Seattle when the baggage carousels didn't tell you what the luggage is on, to a place where you may not have
And you're
water.
referring to the hack at SeaTac recently.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You may not, that's a preview of coming attractions. So I think what I'm worried about is, again, something that is related to the international situation that we're in with this sort of axis of autocracy, finally deciding to leverage things in the United States. And that's, this public's real unawareness of sacrifice and maybe dire times.
Let's overlay artificial intelligence into this and how that changes the coin of the realm.
AI scares me. I drive a Tesla, and I'm waiting for the day that the Tesla decides that it's going to go into the water, and there's nothing I'm going to do about it, and it turns into the car and I robot. So I am worried about AI, and I would say our competitors around the world are investing heavily in AI technologies, and not from a standpoint of AI with ethics. This is AI without ethics. And that's one thing that, again, the United States in the frame of democracy, we have to go slower. We have to make sure that what we're creating is what we should be creating, and in dire scenarios, nobody else is playing by those rules. So that's what scares me is, again, we could be in a position where someone else is using AI tools to run circles around us faster than our own decision-making process can generate.
So in terms of keeping up with, in some respects you're saying get the band back together again and refocus on homeland security, but then the coin of the realm is changing with new technologies. So Washington State has this crack team of cybersecurity experts who are working on that. But as you bring AI into the equation, do you anticipate, for instance, standing up, will we eventually have a team that is devoted to trying to figure out how to thwart rogue AI systems? Or will this cybersecurity team kind of grow its function to be able to address those kinds of threats? Because to your point, we could have a traditional hack that takes down parts of our infrastructure. We could also have an AI-generated attack that shuts down the electrical grid or unleashes something else. And it's a new tool, perhaps, in the tool basket of the foreign adversaries. So how does the Washington National Guard prepare for this new reality?
Ask me in a couple of years. That's literally one that from a counter AI or a counter maligned AI perspective, that's going to be a plane that you build in flight. That's the tough part. That is not a traditional threat that we're used to seeing where, they're building terrorist training camps in this country. Here's how we're going to get after it. AI is just, again, what we know today is going to be different tomorrow. I'm not sure how we counter that right now. That's a topic, that and countering drones and you name it, where I think the pace that threat or that problem can evolve will far outstrip our ability to try to catch up with it. And that's the best excuse I can have right now is we're going to have to work on those things, and we'll see where it goes in a year or two. But the AI threat is huge, and it's coming.
Let's talk about some more old-fashioned threats. We just had the statewide shakeout drill. We know that we are overdue for a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, which could also trigger a tsunami. Obviously, you've mentioned that the military department, your division, oversees the emergency operations division of the state. How do you prepare for and keep prepared as best you can for longstanding underlying threats that are completely unpredictable and will unleash a whole other kind of destruction that we really can't even imagine?
We certainly can't take your eye off it. I mean, that's one of the things that I looked at coming into this job is just how much our emergency management funding has been really in decline. You know, so when you look at emergency management as a bit of an insurance policy, sometimes you sort of raise the deductible and you decide where you're going to take risk, and that's one that some of these more daunting emergency management challenges, there's not enough money to fix them. You know, there's not enough money to buy all the vertical tsunami shelters that we need on the coast. There's not enough money to have all the exercise that we need to do, and at some point, it's managing risk. And you know, my idea would be you still keep talking about it, but you put it in the context of a lot of other things. We have in some ways, the more prevalent threat, you know, in this state is wildfire. You know, I would say climate-induced climate change and wildfires. I mean, it's just hotter than what it was when I was growing up as a kid. It's just the number of 100-degree days in central and eastern Washington is nuts. So the climate, the wildfires, pieces like that, sea level rise, you know, those things I think in some ways are, you know, even as much or greater challenges. But again, back to the whole earthquake piece, there's a reason why we do that great shakeout every year, and that's to remind Washington that this is still a problem. You've got off the coast a Cascadia subduction zone that, you know, from a scientific standpoint, rips every 300 and some odd years. You know, every year that we don't have it, the increases of something happening are getting higher. So,
well, you just gave me a nice opening to then ask about the upcoming legislative session. I know you guys recently did a day where you were showing legislators, kind of inviting them to come in and see what the National Guard is about, see what the emergency management operations are. It was capped off, I think, with a flight on a Black Hawk. They got to fly with a helicopter. So you are proactively reaching out to budget writers, to policymakers, to legislators to remind them of what this agency does. But as you head into the new year and a budget writing year and in this new role, what are you going to be asking for? What will be your message as you start meeting with lawmakers in January?
well, and the message goes back to really some sort of top-down education on just take a look around the world. You know, we're living in some pretty, I think there's a Chinese proverb, you know, may you live in interesting times. You know, we are definitely living in some interesting times. So really just sort of from big to small, trying to educate folks that it's not just the traditional threats that we could face, the fires, it's some other things. But for this specific session, so one main thing, so emergency management, sort of incident management assistance teams. What you find is sort of like Robin Hood, sort of the rich counties and maybe the poor counties. This is one where, you know, disasters don't necessarily care what size your county is. And what you find is a lot of these counties where some disasters are happening more frequently, especially in fires, they don't have the people. You know, they don't have the pickup team essentially to come in and sort of help. They've got one person that's answering the phones. They might be the emergency manager, and they're also doing 5 other jobs. So if we had a team at the emergency management division that we could forward deploy out, you know, maybe it's a dozen folks or so, but could help some of these counties that just are struggling with, you know, processing the frequency of events that we're having. That's probably the main ask. I mean, there's some other asks. There's some policy cleanup issues that we're looking for this year. There's a bill that we're going to try to run that gets after kind of a guard employer tuition credit. But the main emergency management ask is for these teams.
Is there a sort of post-pandemic lessons learned, preparations needed? We obviously hope that's a once in 100 years, if never again. But can we be better prepared in terms of PPE or any number of other kind of lessons from that experience, whether it's directly correlated to a pandemic or just to something that's terribly disruptive of daily life in that same way?
I think the best way to look at some of the lessons from the pandemic are not what things can we buy. It's how we should think about things. It's how we communicate. Is the emergency management process set up, the right way in the state? In some ways, health ran, a lot of the response for
Department of Health, yeah.
for COVID.
Yep.
Is that going to be the case that happens, with something else? I don't know. But I think one of the main lessons is communicate early and often. And that's one thing that I think we did really well, as a state, at least as a state government enterprise. We had a lot of people at the table, and there was a lot of info moving. But the communication piece is something we can always keep looking at.
There's a couple of other things, and we've kind of gone from international and very big picture down to let's get hyper-local here. I was interested to see, just as an example of the kind of drills that the Guard runs, that some of your Guard members were working with Central Pierce Fire and Rescue on a practice mission up at Crystal Mountain to rescue people out of the gondola. Again, this is just a practice, but they do have a gondola there. Mm-hmm. And what if something happened and people need to be rescued? Let's practice this. But can you talk about those kinds of so you're partnering with the Malaysian and Thai military. Right. You're also partnering with local fire departments.
So I think it goes back to something I always tell my son, ask yourself what could possibly go wrong. So if you take that and you look across the state, there's the things, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, things we know, things we know we don't know, things we don't know. Sometimes if we can spend more time in the things we don't know, that's where you find gondola exercises. Where are some non-traditional ways that we can partner maybe that we haven't, But I would also tell you that some of that gets to be higher level math when we have to spend a little bit of time more at the basic rung of Maslow on the food and the shelter. But that's kind of that homeland security reset a little bit. But no, there's great ways to develop partnerships, because you never know. One of the main things about partnerships and really any of our engagements is you don't want a disaster to be the first time you exchange business cards. So whether that's specifically focused on getting folks out of a gondola, or hey, Central Pierce knows a lot more of the National Guard's capabilities the next time something happens, I'd call that a win.
In the context of the men and women that you are overseeing and who are under your command, again, these 8,000 National Guard members, I want to go back to something that General Daugherty and I talked about in our last interview, when he mentioned that he had, before sending Washington Guard members to Washington, D.C. post-January 6th, he re-administered the oath to the Constitution. And he said he had never done that before, but felt that it was perhaps prudent to remind those soldiers and airmen who were going what their purpose was and who they need to be loyal to, or what they need to be loyal to, the Constitution. In these polarized times, and in times of extremism, what message are you pushing down through the ranks about how you show up, how you comport yourself, who you're loyal to, what behavior is expected, what you won't tolerate, when you will exit somebody out of this program without a lot of questions asked? How does that look, sound, feel?
I'll tell you what, whenever I do the oath, I stop on foreign and domestic. I stop on you obey the orders of the President of the United States and the Governor of Washington State. So it's a little bit of a civics lesson on the fly when I do those oaths, especially to somebody that's never taken that thing before. We are in interesting times. But the one thing that really does concern me is if you look back in time, the United States military enjoyed the highest public appreciation rating of really anybody. You sort of had the military up here, and I don't know, nothing against lawyers, but maybe lawyers down there, and Congress not far above. But now it's slipping, and it's slipping because the population sees, in some cases, the military as not apolitical and not, sort of bipartisan. So one of the things I try to emphasize is, again, we don't pick what we get involved in around the state and around the world. Someone else, the competent authority that you just swore an oath to, is the one that's picking that thing out. And you really need to think about that. You need to think about everything we do is in support of law and order and regulations, and so help you God. And sometimes, again, people need that reminder, and I think that was what the boss's perspective at the time was, is really in some ways similar to what General Milley did, and sent a letter from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff signed on to a letter saying, this is what our purpose is, and it's going back to that why, back to that Constitution.
I know there have been cases of extremists in the military, active duty military certainly, and I think in some cases National Guard members, not necessarily in this state, but what is your message around that particular piece of, again, we are in such polarized times, and there are some people who are being attracted to quite extreme groups.
Well, the simple message is there's no place for extremism. In this Washington National Guard, it's certainly the United States military. The military is a reflection of society. You're going to have, I would say, the far left, and you're going to have the far right in your formation. But the thing that unites us is the fact that we have United States Army, United States Air Force on our uniform. Check that other stuff at the door, and nobody's going to infringe on folks' First Amendment rights to believe and talk about what they want to talk about. But when you put this uniform on, you're serving a higher purpose. And if you can't do that, there's probably something else for you to do.
Let's talk briefly about the next generation. One thing that doesn't get a lot of attention is that the Washington Youth Academy is overseen by your agency. It's in Bremerton.
It is.
What is it? And I think you guys are proud of this program. Why so?
Well, it's a program that changes lives every day. I mean, each year we graduate about 300 folks from a youth academy that society, for the most part, had left behind. These are folks that, for whatever reason,
They were getting kicked out of school. They were ending up in trouble.
Absolutely,
They were truant.
a lot of socioeconomical reasons, but society had left them behind. Their parents had left them behind, and in some cases, that youth academy experience was the only thing between them and jail.
It's
or
essentially
them
a
in prison.
military academy and school.
It is. Well, essentially what it is it's a credit recovery program, wrapped around quite a bit of discipline and some structure that maybe some of those folks have never had. But you have a lot of folks at the Youth Academy that are cadre and staff members up there that could be doing a lot of other jobs for a lot more money. But there is something inherently cool in going to work every day and actually seeing the difference that you're making in the lives of other people, and the difference that those folks make, those cadre members make, those staff members make from the first day somebody rolls into that youth academy, 180 days later when they're graduating, is truly life-changing. And you can, that's something that motivates you when you get up in the morning and put your pants on and your boots on. So really great program, and would love to expand it. We'll just see how that goes in the future.
Have any of those graduates ever later on joined the Guard?
They have, and they've gone on to fly airplanes, they've gone on to be officers, they've gone on to great careers. So it's not a military recruiting program as much as it is a get folks back into business program, but they do, once you start wearing combat boots for a while, you may want to do that for a little bit longer.
Okay, we have less than 2 minutes left. I want to end with taking you to your interview with the governor for this position, and why you told the governor, who had the final decision-making in appointing you, why you wanted this job and what you thought you could do to improve the Washington National Guard, with no disparagement to your predecessors.
Honestly, I never got that question.
You didn't?
I never got.
What did he ask you then?
No, he asked me about nuclear deterrence, and he asked me about COVID and some lessons learned, but it was really not about what I can do better. It's where do you see certain things? Where do you see the world in 4 years? Where do you see these situations going? So it was really, thankfully, not a sales pitch about, well, I served here for 6 months and I'm the best. It was really not an interview like that. It was not about me. It was really about how do you serve the state better.
Well, I'll ask you the question then. Where, if we talk again in a year's time or 2 years' time, where do you hope to have made the most inroads? And all of these things we've talked about, understanding that nothing happens quickly here, especially around homeland security, national security. But where do you see the most opportunity?
Well, I see the biggest thing in readiness and people. Just making sure, again, our force is ready to be called upon, whether it's something here in the state, whether it's something across the world, that we've got the most ready and lethal force that we can possibly have. And the second thing is making sure that we've got the people to back that up. We've got the right experience when people come in and join our organization. They're as happy in 4 years as they were the day they joined.
Okay. Adjutant General, Major General Gent Welsh, thanks for coming in and talking to us. Congratulations on this news post. Good luck going forward, and we will talk to you again.
Thanks, Austin.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
and thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.